Hello everyone, welcome to the Kines 293 lecture. Today we're going to continue on with our theme of political domination, and this time we're going to look at how it's operated through the mechanism of race. So in one of the readings, this concept of double consciousness by W.E.B. Du Bois was brought up. And about this, he says it is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. So his goal of formulating this idea of a double consciousness is his attempt to identify, mostly to white America, the psychology of being an African American in the backdrop of not only slavery but Reconstruction and Jim Crow America. He's saying this in 1903. And so, by his concept of double consciousness, he's essentially saying that to be an African American is to always be aware of two conflicting and separate identities as being African American and as being just American, right? So, in this double consciousness, those two are often conflicting, to be black and to be American, because despite the phrase African American, in many people's eyes, African Americans were not Americans. So to have a double consciousness, it's this idea that you constantly need to be aware of how you see yourself, but also part of your identity is how people see you. And he's saying through double consciousness that African Americans are always going around with this sense of viewing themselves through the eyes of others. So, with this theoretical framework, I want to use this to kind of talk about race and the experience of the black athlete. And as we go through this lecture, I want you to ask yourself, in what ways does the reading Wiggins suggest that this double consciousness has historically applied to black athletes? So that's something that we're going to talk about today. So first, we're going to go through a little bit of history of Reconstruction and Jim Crow, talk about the depths of segregation, highlighting Jack Johnson, talk a little bit more about Muhammad Ali, Joe Louis, and some others. And then we're going to talk a little bit about resistance to this oppression, as we always like to end with. All right, so Jim Crow America, let's start here. And before we get into it, I want to bring up this slide from last lecture. And I want to remind you that when we talk about, for today's instance, racism, right? We don't mean racism as one person individually harboring a prejudice towards a black person or a Hispanic Latinx person or Asian person or whatever, right? It's so, well, racism certainly is prejudice, and it certainly is, one individual calling someone an N-word or something like that. The things that people are fighting against when they say racism, the things that more directly shape their life's experience, are institutional. They're structural barriers. And when it comes to race, there's a lot of them, right? So people always talk about the criminal justice system, um, with the way in which it operates, disproportionately affecting the African American community. Job discrimination, right? It doesn't matter if you hate me or if you don't like me because of my skin color, but if you have power over me and you can not hire me because of my skin color, or you can frame me for a crime because of my skin color, then that's a problem, right? So we always have to remember that power is a central part of these isms that we say that shape people's lives. So, with that being said, I want to kind of start in some history that I don't feel like we get enough of, and that's the era of Reconstruction. So, we all hear about the Civil War, right? We fight each other basically for 4 years, and then the Union wins, slavery is abolished, and our history class tells us that's happily ever after, right? From there, it's blacks were free and all was good, right? until 1960s, Martin Luther King came along and he had some beefs, but we kind of hashed those out. And then he died, and then everything was good again. Well, that's not necessarily what happened. So, Reconstruction refers to the era after the Civil War in which we try to reconstruct our nation. So, slavery is abolished with the 13th Amendment, and it goes into effect once the Union wins the war. And the 14th Amendment granted full citizenship to blacks. After the Dred Scott decision that said blacks were not citizens, the 14th Amendment came through and said that they are full citizens with full rights. So that's in 1866, 1 year after the Civil War. So the Southern slaves are legally freed, but they still have a lot of barriers to integration, especially in the South. The KKK, sharecropping, which basically was, now that you're not slaves, you don't have a job and no one's going to hire you. So why don't you, the slave owner says, come back to my plantation. I still need this cotton picked. I still need these crops. And I'll pay you a little bit. So it was essentially slavery with a raise that lasted all the way until 1930s and 40s. And then Andrew Johnson, who just was diametrically opposed to everything regarding racial equality. And so in this backdrop, especially in the South, equality wasn't being instituted to the extent that it should have with the 14th Amendment. So federal troops were sent down into the South to enforce equality and integration of blacks, to make sure that they were being educated, they were being included in places, that they weren't being lynched and killed. Essentially, to the best of their ability, federal troops were deployed to make sure that blacks were equal. And this worked. In this era, black people made great strides. They created their own schools. They were elected to office. They started their own businesses. They got educated. So it was good, right? Immediately after the Civil War, this federal protection was working. But Reconstruction only lasts for about 12 years. So it's a short-lived process. And there's some politics involved, but essentially the Southern Democrats lost all their political power after the Civil War, obviously, because they just seceded and then tried to start a war to preserve slavery and lost. But it only took about a decade for them to get a lot of that power back. And in the election of 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden were tied in the Electoral College. And it was up to the House of Representatives to decide the winner. And so basically there was like some backroom dealings, some House of Cards type stuff, at least how I envision it. And they basically came out with a deal. So the Southern Democrats, they didn't like the federal troops in the South, and they wanted them gone. Because, well, I don't know what their argument was, but seems like they just wanted to treat black people however they wanted them to be treated. So in the Compromise of 1877, the Southern Democrats basically say, okay, we'll let Rutherford B. Hayes, the Northern Republican, we'll let you have the presidency, we'll give you the votes if you end Reconstruction, if you take away these federal troops from our states. Something about states' rights and freedom and blah, blah, blah. But that's what they wanted. And Rutherford B. Hayes agrees to it, says okay, becomes president, and ends Reconstruction. And everything goes back almost to how it was before. All of that progress is just about wiped out, and the South goes back to their brutal tactics of subjugation. And this institutes Jim Crow America, where black people, mostly in the South, but even in the North in a lot of places, are systematically excluded. And Jim Crow refers to, like it says here, an overarching term used to describe many things, many different mechanisms that basically just relegate blacks to second-class citizenship. So segregation, loss of political power, lynching, various different mechanisms to make sure that there was a racial hierarchy. And so in the South, like I said, this conducted of segregation, poll taxes, literacy tests. I'm sorry, disenfranchisement, um, a whole series of what they call black codes, which were essentially these informal expectations that as black people they weren't allowed to do, such as talk to a white woman or um, try to learn how to read, or certainly voting, right? To where a lot of times they would be subjected to judicial violence, but also extrajudicial violence, meaning lynching, meaning informal um, punishment. And so in other parts of the country, right, like I said, in the North, it was much more subtle. It wasn't kind of as blatant, but there was a racial hierarchization through things like redlining, exclusion from union, and therefore the lack of the ability to gain wealth, discriminatory hiring, things that lasted all the way up until basically the 1970s. So this is the context of Jim Crow America in which we're going to be talking about today. So we can largely chop up the African American experience in sport into four different sections. And we're going to go through kind of all of them. Setting the color bar, separate but unequal beginnings of integration and revolution despite ongoing barriers. So I want to start kind of in the post-slavery era. Um, and the story starts, well, I'm going to start the story with sporting minstrelsy. So during slavery, sport was, especially in the South, was certainly in a thriving institution, and sport was one of the ways that slave owners kind of deployed their slaves through things like cockfighting, horse racing. Any slave who showed any kind of talent or anything for these sports were often given special treatment, even though they were not treated equally. But after the Civil War, when slaves are freed, we get sporting minstrelsy. And essentially, what this is sport, but kind of a mix of sport with entertainment. And it's entertainment for whites that kind of highlights the inferiority of blacks, or so was the ideology of the time, right? Basically, it was to make fun of blacks. And it wasn't just sport, this was all types of entertainment. This is where we get the first blackface and things like that. But they essentially, it was funny back then to just make fun of how dumb they thought black people were, or uncivilized, or savage, things like that. Basically, a spectacle that would reinforce white supremacy. And so this cultural tradition seeps into physical culture, and we get battle royales. And in the late 1800s and early to mid 1900s, they were popular in the South. And essentially, what they were was this kind of racialized and dehumanizing mixture of boxing and bare knuckle fighting. And only blacks were allowed to participate, while basically whites just watched and placed bets and cheered. And although they were paid for it, the purpose was to dehumanize, right? It was a form of minstrelsy and further entrench white supremacy. Let me show you a cringeworthy video.
Full of big-fisted black boys in a no-rule elimination bout. Man, oh man, how those hombres can slug. I wouldn't want to be in the ring with that big fella. Ooh, some of those in the ring feel the same way, it seems. They've ganged up on him. It'll take a lot of punching to knock him out, though. Oh, he's crying to the referee about this gang business, but it's no use. Look at that nervy Negro. If he wants to live now, he'd better grow wings. Ah, another blackout. Full of
Yeah. So essentially, they were, in a way, they were staged. In a way, they were just told to go out there and, beat someone up. But essentially, it was a spectacle which made white people laugh at how stupid and savage black people were back then. It was a very racist kind of form of physical culture. So while this is going on, more kind of formal sports are starting to burgeon, such as baseball and football, a little bit like we talked about in previous lectures. But within all of this professional sport, African Americans were excluded. Sometimes it was legally in law saying black people um, could not participate, but other times it was just de facto through gentleman's agreement that the people, the owners, the executives wouldn't give licenses to teams that would hire blacks or wouldn't let blacks try out, just wouldn't hire them, right? And this lasted all the way in all the major sports until the 1940s, except one major sport, and it was one of the biggest sports at that time, if not the biggest sport, and that's professional boxing.
This contest of men with padded gloves is a sport that belongs unequivocally to the English-speaking race. It is no superficial thing, a fad of a moment or a generation. It is as deep as our consciousness and is woven into the fibers of our being. This is the ape and the tiger in us, granted. But it is in us, isn't it? Jack London.
At the turn of the century, boxing was one of the three big sports. There was horse racing, baseball, and boxing, and it dominated the sports page, such as it was. Boxing then was still a little bit in its infancy. In many states, it was outlawed, pure and simple, outlawed.
But even those who deplored boxing knew the name of the heavyweight champion of the world, the Boston Strong Boy, the monarch of the prize ring, John L. Sullivan. His mustached portrait hung in almost every saloon in America.
John L. Sullivan gave the heavyweight champion its sort of imprimatur. He called it the strongest man in the world. It was the singular, most important title in the world outside of being a general or a president.
Sullivan really, in America, made this championship mean something. He made being a boxing champion. You suddenly became sort of like the emperor of masculinity. It's what you were.
The Emperor of Masculinity. And that video just goes to show kind of the cultural place of boxing. As an individual sport, there was power in being a winning boxer, especially a dominant boxer. Okay, so faced with this exclusion because of the gentleman's agreement, as we know, a lot of African Americans developed parallel institutions, the Negro Leagues, black tennis, black golf, for a sport that was segregated. But boxing did not do that. Boxing was not completely segregated. They let black people box. And the reason that they did that, scholars suggest, is because there was power in kind of these symbolic racial victories. Letting black people box and letting white people, especially, beat them, basically was a way to reinforce the white supremacy, reinforce the idea at this time that blacks are both physically and mentally inferior. Yes, at this time, the idea was that blacks were physically inferior. And boxing was a way to show that. Until Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson was a famous boxer at the turn of the century, probably the most famous black athlete at his time, probably the first world famous black athlete. And so he was a boxer that was really good, but he infuriated a lot of white America and even some of black America because he essentially, quote unquote, didn't know his place. He didn't stay in his lane. He was very defiant of the expectations of how African Americans should act at his time. So that meaning he did a lot of things that were taboo. He talked smack to his opponents, right? He didn't defer. He didn't get out of the way on the sidewalk. He drove nice cars. He liked white women. And so a lot of these things he was seen as a detriment to his race, right? As if they were respected anyways, but he was seen as kind of the bad boy that was everything that was wrong with black people, essentially. And so even a lot of African American leaders thought that he would poorly represent the race. Now, in today's standards, he didn't, like I said, he just did things like was flashy and dated white women. Nothing, he wasn't an actual bad person, right? But in the context of a Jim Crow America where half the things that Jack Johnson did would get you lynched, he was kind of a controversial figure. And so there have always been kind of the white heavyweight champions of the world. And African Americans could fight for a lot of boxing champions, but white heavyweight champions, which was kind of the main thing, they often avoided black challengers. And so Jack Johnson was always looking for a chance to be the heavyweight champion, to take down the white heavyweight champions. And what he did was, in 1908, he fought Canadian Tommy Burns, who was a good fighter, but not someone, he wasn't the champion. But he was still a good enough opponent that it made people kind of raise an eyebrow about Jack Johnson, to the point where with every victory that Jack Johnson was accumulating, people were starting to not only pay attention to Jack Johnson, but question their own racial beliefs. Jim Jeffries, after the Tommy Burns fight, who was the white heavyweight champion, then agreed to fight Jack Johnson. And here you can see kind of the cultural and racial subtext. This was a quote from a newspaper columnist at the time. Can the huge white man Jeffries, who people viewed as the great white hope that would finally beat down this cocky black guy that nobody liked, can the huge white man Jeffries beat down the wonderful black and restore the Caucasians the crown of elemental greatness as measured by the strength of blow, power of heart and being, and with all the cunning of keenness that denotes mental as well as physical superiority? So as you can see here, this is not just Jack Johnson versus Jim Jeffries. This is framed as the white race versus the black race, with racial hierarchy on the line, right? Centuries of racial ideologies and stereotypes that were the basis of discrimination are on the line in this fight.
Almost immediately, the call went out for a great white hope. Reporter Jack London spoke for many Americans.
But one thing now remains. Jim Jeffries must now emerge from his alfalfa farm and remove that golden smile from Jack Johnson's face. Jeff, it's up to you. The white man must be rescued.
Each punch landed, Johnson chipped away at the ideals of the nation. Never again would the heavyweight title be only the white man's domain.
And when the fight ended, it was just silence. Nobody cheered. People filtered out of the stadium as if it was a wake, as if they were mourning the passing of something, which they were.
As soon as the fight ended, the riots began.
Invariably, blacks were killed. In New York, throughout the South, in cities large and small, and they would just attack. White mobs would attack blacks.
Johnson returned to Chicago. His drinking and carousing increased. Often short on cash, he fought any great white hope sent his way. Openly taunting his challengers, Johnson's showboating was considered a bad example for the nation's Negroes. The FBI launched a movement to rid the country of the champ. 1 month after Jeffries' defeat, Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis charged Johnson with transporting white women across state lines for immoral purposes. Found guilty, Johnson fled the country.
So Jack Johnson takes down Jim Jeffries and becomes the heavyweight champion of the world. And people go crazy, right? There's race riots. Shortly after, Jack Johnson is prosecuted under the Mann Act, which was basically transporting white women, right? They accused him basically of kidnapping white women, even though it was somebody that he was with at the time. Eventually, he was exiled to Cuba. And because of Jack Johnson, African Americans were denied another title shot until the 1930s. So, despite kind of this sad ending, but predictable one, right? Because people had their entire racial thoughts upended. Jack Johnson is a significant figure because he shows that for the first time, blacks are not inferior to whites. So we'll skip ahead to Jackie Robinson. And what do we know about Jackie Robinson? Well, we all know kind of the Hollywood story of Robinson, right? He's this really quiet, good character guy that baseball is segregated, and then he comes along, and Branch Rickey takes a chance on him, and he tells Jackie Robinson, "Don't fight, don't be mean to anyone, turn the other cheek, blah blah blah." And it works, and baseball is integrated, and racism is solved, and everyone's happy, right? That's kind of the Jackie Robinson that we know. But the real story is a little bit more complicated than that. So, like I said, baseball had a gentleman's agreement that made sure it was segregated. But baseball, as America's pastime, soon became a target of civil rights activists because of its symbolism within our culture. So if you integrate America's pastime, that's symbolic of integrating African Americans into being American citizens, essentially, right? And in response to this pressure, MLB execs came up with a bunch of excuses, right? And basically all of them saying, we're not racist, blacks are just not good enough to play in the league, right? Well, they had a one-armed dude playing in the league, who I'm sure was great, but they had legends in the Negro leagues at the time. Satchel Paige, Josh Gibson, two of the best players in the world, and everybody knew it at the time. But anyways, so as we fought World War II, basically saying, yeah, we're going to save the world from oppressing people because we're America and we fight the bad guys, right? It became increasingly difficult to justify segregation as not only we were fighting Nazi Germany, but then as we went in the Cold War and tried to say, be capitalist democracy, we're great, right? It's hard to say that with the way that they treated certain people in America, especially the blacks. So it's within this context that segregation became kind of a sore spot, right, for the nation. And we get this push to integrate professional sports. And so in 1947, Branch Rickey signs Jackie, making him the first MLB player. And the story that we know, under orders from Branch Rickey, he wasn't to react to any of the racial provocations. When people called him the N-word, he was supposed to turn the other way, and he was supposed to just take it. And he did, essentially. But that wasn't kind of his personality. He wasn't this docile person, as we'll talk about in a minute. But he was so good that right away he shattered the myth that black people weren't good enough. He won the Rookie of the Year award. And with him, the Dodgers won the pennant and attracted a lot of African Americans as fans and made a lot of money. And basically, it was good, right? Some people say it was good that they integrated baseball, but what it also meant was that it was the end of the Negro Leagues because soon all the good players were going to the MLB. They took all the talented players and didn't compensate the Negro Leagues for purchasing the player contracts. They just took it. So, well, integration is often seen as this great thing, right? There were drawbacks to it, and a lot of people say that it wasn't a good thing because all it did was shift power and money into white-owned businesses that further went into their pockets while exploiting black labor. A institution that kind of is the same structure today. That's what some scholars suggest, but it's an ongoing debate. However, much of this was token integration, right? It was integration that didn't allow black players to have any meaningful power like they had in their own institutions. And for a lot of years, there were quotas that you can only have a certain number of African American players. You also had stacking occur, something that scholars argue still happens today, where you would take African American players and put them in positions that emphasized their physicality, right? Because at this time, there's a myth of black physical superiority. So positions where they wouldn't have to think, because thinking was seen as a white person's thing. So in football, this worked as, okay, you can't be quarterback. We have Peyton Manning as our quarterback. He's a thinker. He's a tactician. He's a leader. He has all these traits. You're going to line up at defensive end. Just go get the quarterback. You don't have to think. Or you're at cornerback. Just guard the wide receiver. Follow every movement that he makes, right? So we still see this a little bit today. But certainly throughout history, stacking has been something that's been based on a lot of false racial ideologies. There's also a glass ceiling that excluded a lot of African Americans from positions of power, right? Positions of management and ownership and being executives, things that weren't open to them back then, and scholars argue even today. So while history writes Jackie Robinson as this kind of docile hero, right, who he just defeated racism with his docility, right, with the help of these brave white people who were good, and then it was happily ever after. It's too rosy of a portrayal. In reality, Jackie was not this kind of unassuming figure. He was an avid civil rights fighter. He fought viciously for racial equality, not only while he was playing, but afterwards. And because of it, he was hated. People didn't just love Jackie Robinson like we do today. People didn't like him because of his views, and even more so once he started to speak out more. And a lot of scholars suggest, and a lot of evidence suggests, that Ricky and the other white executives who were seen as the impetus for this integration was really only interested in profit rather than integration. And it didn't solve racism in the MLB. It still persisted. And a lot of people make the point that the MLB is still the main profiteer of Jackie's legacy today, with how many 42 jerseys they sell in every single color every year that Jackie and his kin see none of. Okay, so sport is integrated now, right? Now what are they going to complain about? What do blacks have to say now? Well, like I said, it's still not happily ever after. Like I said, Brown v. Board strikes down segregation in broader society, and that seeps into physical culture as well. But there's still not equal opportunity because of the quotas and stackings and glass ceiling and the destruction of the African American infrastructure of sport. So in this context, you get the rise of Cassius Clay. He wins the Olympic gold medal as a light heavyweight, and he's seen as this kind of, we all know his personality, as we've seen, expressive, candid, indulgent, flamboyant, immodest, confident, black cultural style, a la Jack Johnson, right? So for some people, it's a bad reminder. He's another one that doesn't know his place. And so he defeats Sonny Liston for the heavyweight title in '64, and he joins the Nation of Islam. Now, even Jack Johnson wasn't political. He just did his own thing, right, and lived his own life. But Cassius Clay, at this point, becomes political. He starts speaking out about things. He changes his name to Muhammad Ali. And it was controversial because it was connected to the Nation of Islam, which people at that time considered a hate group. It wasn't, right, but people didn't respect it. They still called him Clay. And he was winning, right? And he spoke out and he said that I'm changing my name because Cassius Clay, or Clay, my last name, is my slave name. And people didn't like what he was saying. So, like we talked about in, I think, the first lecture, he gets drafted into the army to fight in Vietnam. He refuses as a conscientious objector. But most importantly, he's the first revolutionary, radical black athlete.
I want to eat him up. Too much speed for him. Too fast. Too fast. That's right. I'm a retired heavyweight champion of the world. I'm going to retire the heavyweight champion of the world. September the 25th, the world will be stunned. Feel it, buddy. That's right. If you think the world was surprised when Nixon resigned, wait till I kick Fulmer's behind.
He was handsome. He was articulate. He was funny. Charismatic, and was whooping ass too.
The close heavyweight champion Cassius Clay at a federal court in Houston is found guilty of violating the U.S. Selective Service laws by refusing to be inducted. He is sentenced to 5 years in prison and fined $10,000.
The way he fused politics and sports, very few black athletes have ever talked the way Muhammad Ali talked without fear of something happening to him, their career.
His status as a black Muslim minister made him exempt from the draft.
He was already very unpopular with mainstream Americans because he had joined an organization known as the Nation of Islam, which was perceived as a radical black separatist group. And then on top of that, when he was called for induction and refused to take the step forward, he absolutely infuriated America.
Why do you insist on being called Muhammad Ali now? That's the name given to me by my leading teacher, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. That's my original name. That's a black man name. Cassius Clay is my slave name. I'm no longer a slave. What does it mean? Muhammad means worthy of all praises, and Ali means most high.
When he said that he was a member of the Nation of Islam and that he was a follower of Elijah Muhammad, that was my
raised him to be a Christian and took him to church every Sunday when he was small on up till he got out, in the world on his own, and then he got in this organization, which we do not.
Well, you know that's impossible.
No, keep it close.
You know that's impossible. I'm the greatest. And I'm knocking out all bums. And if you get too small, I'll knock you out.
National Guard calling all the police. Tell them to come down hard, ain't gonna be no peace. Cause if you think I'm gonna Uncle Tom, you might as well gonna get your bum, cause it's all over now. Mighty Whitey, it's all over now.
I hereby declare that this assembly is unlawful.
All right, this is a sports order. Get out of here. Back up. All of you, back up. You're so quiet.
Okay, so with an America that's used to its black athletes being quiet, right, knowing their place, Jesse Owens, Joe Louis, even Jackie Robinson, as the popular imagination pegged him out to be, an athlete, especially a good athlete that was winning in one of America's most foremost sports, that was talkative, that wasn't afraid, that was unapologetic, took the world by storm. And so you could see who was interested in trying to bring him down. After he didn't go to Vietnam, states revoked his boxing license and his title was stripped, sentenced to prison, right? He appealed it. Eventually, he went to the Supreme Court, which overruled his conviction, so he didn't serve any time. But after that, his career was never the same. He never reached the same ascendant status. And he was essentially neutralized until today's day and age, when we understand him as this figure that was brave and courageous and that everybody loved, right? As history always tends to do. But people didn't like him, right? People hated him. Well, some people hated him. Most people hated him, if you know what I mean. So, despite these barriers, right, it wasn't all good since Muhammad Ali. They've integrated well into sports, especially the physical quote-unquote sports of football and basketball. But there's still a glass ceiling, there's still stacking, and there's still this pervasive myth of the natural black athlete that does a lot of harm outside of sports that refuses to go away, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. However, a lot of black athletes today, still plagued by this double consciousness, have resisted the historical and ongoing barriers that existed because they were African American. And so that's where we'll pivot right now, to this resistance. So, real quick, again, Jim Crow, kind of formal and informal codes that basically worked to keep black people at second-class citizenship and to make sure that equality was not served. So, as an African American, how do you exist in Jim Crow? How do you survive? Or even how do you try to progress and advance your race during this era of inequality? Well, Dorrance recognizes 3 A's of resistance, 3 strategies that were used by African Americans: aggression, accommodation, and avoidance. So we'll go through these. W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP was kind of the figurehead of aggression. And this essentially meant fighting for civil rights through legal challenges. Whereas Booker T. Washington was the figurehead of accommodation, right? He said that African Americans should achieve they can earn respect from whites by working hard. Whereas Marcus Garvey was the figurehead of avoidance in the Pan-African movement, which said that we'll need to avoid the very institutions that are oppressing us because they'll never come around to liking us. So let's dig a little bit deeper into each. So, aggression. W.B. Du Bois, he was the first black man to get a PhD from Harvard, and he established the NAACP and was kind of the foremost black intellectual of his time. And his strategy was to aggressively pursue the cause of racial justice, right? He believed that all Americans were entitled to full civil rights and that they couldn't just be earned, right? They didn't have to be earned. By very virtue of being a human, you were entitled to civil rights. And so his strategy was to confront segregation and challenge it through legal, economic, and institutional means, whether that be through lawsuits, through boycotts, through protests. Whatever you needed to do was worth it to fight for your full equality as a citizen. And Du Bois was the adversary of Booker T. Washington, who was the foremost person that advocated for accommodation. And essentially, his argument was that what black people needed to do before they could ask for equality and before they could ask for civil rights was earn the respect of the white majority. And they could only do that through hard work and an industrial education. And eventually, once they worked hard, and once whites saw that they could work hard and do the same thing that whites do, whites will eventually see the light and respect them. And therefore, they'll have equality, right? So they needed to accommodate the racism of the time. Now, I did this a little bit backwards because Booker T. Washington's ideas came first, for which W.B. Du Bois completely tore apart, basically saying that Booker was misguided, and that's exactly what racist white people want you to do. But anyways, this was kind of the black conservative approach to racial inequality. Now, for context, it seems like, well, I should just say that while W.B. Du Bois is fighting for aggression, he's in the North, right? In Harvard, New York, whereas Booker T. Washington is operating in Atlanta. He's in the South. So a lot of the things that W.E.B. Du Bois can get away with, Booker T. Washington is seeing his friends get lynched for. So that's just a little bit more context. Still, a lot of scholars today kind of look back at Booker T as kind of saying, what was he thinking? You were wrong. But there still is a strain in which people identify with Booker T. Now, the third one was avoidance, like I said, and this coalesced in black nationalism with Marcus Garvey and Elijah Muhammad. And Marcus Garvey, in 1914, he founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which kind of followed W.E.B. Du Bois's method and fought for social, political, and economic freedom. But he didn't see that as going anywhere. And he advocated for black nationalism, which was the idea that the diaspora, those of African descent living in places that they were shipped off to, they share this collective bond, and that they'll never be able to coexist with whites. And not just by virtue of being white, but they'll never be able to coexist with the people that for centuries enslaved them and continue to oppress them without any remorse. And so he said, instead, we should stop trying to get along with these people who clearly don't care about us and clearly have our worst interests in mind. And we should focus on uplifting the black community. And a lot of people in this movement also believe that eventually black people, the only answer is to move back to Africa and build back up Africa, despite the kind of colonial teardown that was going on there. But they said that moving back to Africa and being amongst their own people was the only viable option for an equitable existence. So that was another strain. Regardless, there's four kind of waves of resistance in which these themes play out in the black athlete. And that's during Jim Crow, fighting for recognition and legitimacy, late Jim Crow, pushing for desegregation, the Civil Rights era, pushing for social justice actively and unapologetically, and then post-Civil Rights, post-1970s, a dialing down of activism and the depoliticization of the black athlete. So we'll go through these early waves. We have Joe Louis. And he's a person that kind of followed the accommodation route. He was a black boxer who was in the 1930s, was the heavyweight champ of the world, and he became a hero in not only black America, but white America, and he was somebody that white America could coalesce around. And so since Jack Johnson, about 20, 30 years before him, kind of rubbed people the wrong way, Joe Louis was somebody that was good. He never spoke out of turn. He knew his place. He was likable. He deferred to white people. He accommodated them. He always acted in the appropriate manner in which blacks were expected to act. In the 1930s, of course, we get Nazi Germany touting their Aryan stuff. And as I talked about, sport offered a chance to win symbolic victories that could be propaganda. One of these victories was the heavyweight fight between Joe Louis and Max Schmeling, where in 1936, Joe Louis fought the big Aryan German Max Schmeling and knocked him out. And this was kind of the first time that America rallied around a black man. And they did so because it was symbolic of U.S. democracy's defeat, or potential defeat, of German fascism. And so he returned to America after this fight, a hero and a leading figure, but he didn't live happily ever after. He was exploited for his life, mistreated, managers took money from him, people did a lot of bad stuff to him, and he lived the rest of his life in debt and isolated. But kind of his legacy, as a famous sports writer said, the first time I heard a black man called an American was in the Schmeling and Joe Louis fight. Jesse Owens was a very similar story. a quiet and accommodating figure who knew his place, so to speak, but was a nationally renowned track athlete. And despite pleas from the NAACP not to even go to the 1936 games in Berlin under such an oppressive regime, Owens decided he was going to go anyways, and he was going to win, essentially. And he did. He won 4 golds, and as we kind of all know the story goes, showed up Hitler, right? Kind of shattered his spectacle of Aryan supremacy. However, something that kind of flies under the radar is that when Owens came back, he wasn't really appreciative of America. He stated that his treatment in Nazi Germany was better than his treatment in America. When he was in Germany, he had full rights. He could go anywhere he wanted. He was treated equally. He was treated with respect, right? Now, obviously, Nazi Germany was not a equal society or even a free kind of progressive society. But he said that when he returned to the United States, he returned to a country that was still segregated, that even though he just won 4 medals for them, told him he could only stay in a certain hotel, drink from a certain water fountain, and sit in a certain seat in a restaurant, and refused to even acknowledge his achievements, as FDR basically denied allowing him to come to the White House to meet him. All right, so the third wave, sports during the Civil Rights Movement. A little bit prior to the Civil Rights Movement, and to understand it, you have to understand the advent of Black Pride. And so around the 1920s, we get this movement where after centuries of internalizing the racial ideologies that Black people are inferior and uncivil and savage and pre-modern, the Black Pride movement aims to take these negative stereotypes and upend them, turn blackness into something to be prideful of, to reappropriate a lot of these things that white people were saying and flip them, right? And so this idea was that blackness was not something to be ashamed of, as it had been in that time and for centuries prior, but it should be a source of pride. And within the context of this movement, we get Black cultural forms like art, music, literature, business, and sport start to flourish. We get Harlem start to be diffused at an unprecedented rate. And a lot of this, the figurehead of this movement is Malcolm X.
Who taught you, please, who taught you to hate the texture of your hair? Who taught you to hate the color of your skin to such extent that you bleach to get like the white man? Who taught you to hate the shape of your nose and the shape of your lips? Who taught you to hate yourself from the top of your head to the soles of your feet? Who taught you to hate your own kind? Who taught you to hate the race that you belong to? So much so that you don't want to be around each other. No, before you come asking Mr. Muhammad, does he teach hate, you should ask yourself who taught you to hate being what God gave you.
Who taught you how to hate your kind, right? And so this is kind of the heart and soul of the Black Pride movement. It's essentially saying we can't live our lives being ashamed of being Black. We need to find pride in our own being. Because of this, we get the flourishment of, like I said, Black literature, Black art. We get the writing of Hughes, Baldwin, the music of Louis Armstrong, the Harlem Renaissance. And so I bring this up because it's only in this context that Muhammad Ali's cockiness, so to speak, can be understood, right? It was a time when blackness was no longer something to be ashamed of, but something to be celebrated. Muhammad Ali was working in this tradition of Black pride to kind of show to America that we are no longer going to be someone that is just going to take the second seat, and smile at you while doing it. No, we're here for our civil rights. And we're going to be prideful, and we're going to love ourselves and make what we can of our situation in the process. And so in this time, we also get Negro League Baseball that also is in this tradition. So segregated from the MLB, as we know, black people formed their own league. And it was celebrated by the African American community. It wasn't this second rate thing, it was something that people preferred even to the MLB. Now, they had some of the best teams in the Negro League at the time. As you can see, they still had, white newspapers still had kind of racist, minstrel characterizations of it, but it was good baseball. And what they did was they formulated their own style of play in the image of black culture. And they took baseball and they took the way that they played, which was slightly different than the MLB, and they took it as a source of pride rather than a demarcation of oppression. And so, for example, teams and players had nicknames after symbols of blackness. Stars were memorialized in the black community. They started the All-Star game, and popular stereotypes of blacks were flipped and challenged through humor. And so it was similar to the kind of the tricky basketball of the Harlem Globetrotters that took a lot of these racial stereotypes as the, happy-go-lucky black and reappropriated them in a funny way, right? And that led to this tricky baseball that exhibited the flair of the black community at that time. It was a conscious reappropriation of these minstrel stereotypes that we saw in minstrel shows and battle royales. Here's a little excerpt from The Soul of the Game, which was about the Negro Leagues. Satchel Paige to the top batter in the league, Josh Gibson.
Get off, Jesse. Slow down now, slow down. Now batting from the Philadelphia Stars. And on going, old man.
Josh Gibson is saying something to Satchel Paige.
Dreams, you be dreaming, boy.
Let me see if I can pick up what he's saying.
You better go and get him out of there before I come up there and kick your narrow ass in the next week.
Oh, boy. Well, Gibson just issued a personal challenge to the legendary hurler.
Can't be. Ain't nobody scared of Satchel Paige. Ain't anybody seen Satchel Paige. I reckon he ain't coming around here today.
I'm gonna walk this fella.
What are you talking about?
I'm gonna walk him so I can get to Josh.
Josh Bat's cleanup. You gotta walk two fellas to get to him.
Man, that's just perfect. I got two places left for him.
No, now we're gonna have some fun out here. What the hell is he doing?
Goddamn Satch. What are you doing? Back to where you belong, Junior. You're hurting yourself. I thought you done learned this is my game.
Damn it, Satchel, listen to me. Satch. Dodgers don't go for this stuff.
The way you become such an expert on the violence.
Just play games, Satch.
I'm playing my game. You play your game. Come on now.
I like the way you shake that thing, Satchel. We'll put something on it here.
And that's way outside, and Paige has just walked the bases loaded to get to Josh Gibson. Oh, my. Oh, boy. Grab the children, Cornelia. A big storm is brewing here today. The bases are loaded. Satchel Paige on the mound. Gibson at the plate. Campanella touching.
This here's my last inning, big man. You stick around, you get your taters off these other fools.
Satchel Paige looking in for the sign, stepping up to the rubber. Josh Gibson digging in at the plate. Bases loaded. Here's the windup. And the pitch. Swing and a miss. Strike one. Satchel Paige throwing some high heat today. Satchel Paige looking in for the signal. The windup. The pitch, and he swings it. There's a long fly ball to deep right field. It could be. It is. Foul ball. Oh, no.
Yeah, keep your eyes on me. Don't you ever take your eyes off of me. So you're gonna be a kid to your knees, boy.
He looks.
Here's the pitch.
So this clip encapsulates a couple of things about the Negro League. Number one, it talks about that prideful black style that I'm talking about. The dancing, the trash talking, the things that they made fun about their own game. Whereas in the MLB, as we know, if you even so much as blink at a pitcher, he'll throw a 100-mile-an-hour fastball at your face, and that's seen as just this like tradition. Trash talk was something that was treasured in the league. And you also saw how when the person came up to talk to Satchel Paige, he said, "Come on, Satch, the Dodgers won't go for this," right? Essentially saying that some people were there to impress the white leagues, and Satchel Paige was saying, basically, I don't care about no Dodgers, right? I'm taking pride in what I'm doing right now. All right, so that was baseball. Civil rights and basketball, right? We saw Bill Russell was one of the probably the best player in the league throughout the 50s and 60s on the Boston Celtics, who were the best team, won 11 titles. But even as the league's best player, perennial MVP, he was refused meals, hotel rooms, and subject to racist chants from his own fans and opposing fans. In response, he was an outspoken supporter of civil rights movement, Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X, and anyone who kind of white America saw as a racial agitator. And of course, we love Bill Russell today, but in his time, he was not widely liked. Same thing with Lew Alcindor, right? He was someone that was a very political black athlete, right? Just like Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali. In the tradition of black pride, he switched his name from Lew Alcindor to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and he decided to boycott the 1968 Olympics, which the article talks about, was a controversial decision that, shocker, made people not like him. In 1966, we have the first all-black college basketball team, and basically, as the movie Glory Road talks about, they run the table through the season, meet Kentucky, the all-white team in the title game who had yet to integrate, and win the game, right? And it signals acceptance in college basketball as well, another big thing. Female athletes, right? They are also involved in, if not at the forefront of the civil rights movement. So in 56, we have Althea Gibson, who becomes the first black athlete to win a tennis Grand Slam, right? And she goes on for 10 more. She also breaks the color barrier in the LPGA, one of the most underrated athletes of all time. I don't know why we don't talk about Althea Gibson. Well, I do know why. She's a woman. But one of the greatest athletes of all time. In the 56 and 60 Olympics, we get Wilma Rudolph, who is the fastest woman in the world and becomes probably the most widely known black woman across the globe. And also, as we talk about with in the reading, there's still this, in 1968, the kind of heart of the civil rights movement, a lot of inequality that San Jose State professor Harry Edwards tries to organize black athletes to boycott the games, knowing that black labor is winning a lot of these medals for the United States without proportionate benefit in response. And so the Olympic Project for Human Rights threatens a boycott unless the team added African American coaches, excluded apartheid nations, and gave Muhammad Ali his license back.
When I was asked how did I feel about the unrest in the U.S. and what was happening, the mistreatment of blacks, I would always say that I grew up with it, I understand it, I know what it is, I feel something has to be done with it. And who's to say where the battlefield is, if it's on the athletic field or if it is in politics. Something needs to be changed and somebody has to make a statement.
The 1968 Olympic trials set the stage for the most dramatic political protest in modern sports history. Black athletes debated the form their protests would take. San Jose State professor Harry Edwards called for a boycott of the games in Mexico City. The black community was divided over this new militancy and the possibility of a boycott.
I deplore the idea of where politics will enter into the Olympic Games because, as you know, the Olympic Games was set up to dispel any political or religious faith that, that might be invoked into the Games itself.
If today the conditions were the same and the Negro was breaking in, and I was that Negro breaking in, I would join these protests so that my children and their children wouldn't have to go through the same things that I went through trying to break down discrimination.
So, as the reading talks about, it's a very significant event in not only sport, but the broader civil rights movement. And the boycott fails, right, because of, a lot of reasons that the reading talks about. But we still get this iconic image of Tommy Smith and John Carlos raising the Black Power fist after they win the medal in the Olympics. And this is kind of the symbol of the civil rights movement and kind of the revolt of the black athlete. All right, so the modern wave. What does black activism look like now, right? Well, black athletes have become depoliticized, according to many scholars, right? With the rise of neoliberal corporatism, in which each athlete is becoming their own brand and there's money on the line with every single action in the move you take, there's careful management of your persona. And so as a result, we get this push for the depoliticization and deracialization in sport as a way to maintain a wide fan base, right? And that you can profit from, not want to alienate anyone. And so we get global superstars such as Michael Jordan and Charles Barkley striving for neutrality in political and social issues. As the famous quote goes, Michael Jordan, when asked why he wouldn't endorse the Democrat against a pretty blatantly racist Republican, he said, "Republicans buy sneakers too." And Charles Barkley as well said, "I'm not a role model," basically saying, don't have your kids look up to me. I'm not a role model. I just play sports. And so this partially was from advice from Nike and other corporate endorsers who had more at stake in their persona. And also their belief in the mythology of sport itself as being anti-political. This wasn't ubiquitous, though. In 1992, the same year that Jordan allegedly said the Republicans buy sneakers too, quote, his teammate Craig Hodges wore a dashiki to the White House and criticized George H.W. Bush for how he treated poor people and minorities. And he was also critical of Michael Jordan for not using his platform as the biggest black man in the world to speak on anything. That summer, he was released from the Bulls and never received another offer, despite being only 32 and one of the best three-point shooters in the league. Similarly, in 1991, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf didn't stand for the national anthem. And he said that the U.S. flag is a historical symbol of oppression and tyranny. And he was suspended by the NBA until they compromised by allowing him to bow his head and recite the Muslim prayer during the anthem. So we have our first anthem controversy. So we see these four waves of resistance that I talked about that we've gone through. Well, in 2019 and in the 2010s, I don't know if we can say that it's depolitical again, right? We have my man Derrick Rose with the I Can't Breathe shirt after Eric Garner's death. Hands up, don't shoot, pay equality. Even Michael Jordan said, I can no longer stay silent. We have, as we know, all these different stands that black athletes are making. And so I want to ask you the question, is there a fifth wave of athlete resistance? If so, what does it entail? What is the cause? What caused it? What's the impetus? And what are its goals? how does it play out? How do we see it working in modern day sports? And what impact does it have? And also, what are the continuities or discontinuities within each wave? So those are the questions I'll leave you with. Thank you for listening to this lecture, and I'll see you next time.